Okay, well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Adam Higginbotham. Adam is a writer for The New Yorker, The New York Times, New York Times Magazine, Wired, GQ, and the Smithsonian. He is also the author of the award-winning book Midnight in Chernobyl. I have read the book. If you're interested in the events of Chernobyl, I would highly recommend you take a read of it. It is a terrific accounting of how Chernobyl went down from start to finish. However, the book that we are here to talk about today is his latest book, and it is called Challenger, a true story of heroism and disaster on the edge of space. And again, I have read this book, and it is a awesome, awesome book, and it is a must read. And we have a number of younger folks who would be listening to this because the events of Challenger happened in 1986. And I bet you for a lot of the listeners, they weren't even born in 1986. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a quick recap of the events before we get into details. So here's just kind of the high level synopsis of the Space Shuttle Challenger. So for those that don't know, the Space Shuttle Challenger took off from the launch pad on January 28th, 1986, and it exploded approximately 90 seconds after liftoff. The disaster at the time played out live on CNN. So again, if you go on YouTube, you can actually watch the live feed on CNN. And if I wasn't concerned about copyright, I would play it now because again, it's an incredible video, frankly, watching the shuttle take off. One of the reasons why it was such a high profile takeoff is because the Space Shuttle Challenger at the time carried the first civilian into space who was a teacher. So again, the nation was watching. The other unique aspect of this, it wasn't just the nation, it was the younger folks of the nation watching one of their heroes, being a teacher, hopefully be the first one into space. That's obviously not how it ended. It ended with the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding approximately 90 seconds after takeoff. Adam has written a terrific account of the entire sequence of events of Challenger. Now, Adam, I'm going to self-confess, when I first got your book and I saw 400 pages, I was a little bit concerned because I'm thinking, well, I kind of knew everything about Challenger. What are you going to tell me in 400 pages? This might take a while to get through. But then I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. And the 400 pages goes through in a blink of an eye. And the amount of the amount of detail and facts that I wasn't aware of with respect to Challenger was astounding. And I went down the Challenger rabbit hole, tried to find out, after I read your book, trying to find out every series I could possibly watch with respect to Challenger. I've learned more about O-rings than I ever thought possible. There was a lot I didn't know about the Challenger disaster. And I think as well, the other big thing which plays relevant today as it did in 1986 is the concept of decision making and ethics surrounding decision making, which again, that hasn't changed in whatever it's been 30 or 40 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before I get into Challenger, I just want to go back and talk about your previous book just for a second, Adam, because I also think that there's some comparables between the previous book you wrote on Chernobyl and the most recent book that you wrote on Challenger that I think are interesting. So maybe as a first question for you, first of all, thank you very much for joining. We really appreciate you taking the time. Second of all, though, is that you've written two books. Both of them are disasters, man-made disasters. Why the focus on disaster writing? Is that why the focus on Chernobyl and Challenger? I guess as a starting question.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
No, it's not because I have some ghoulish fascination with disasters, but the reason that disasters are interesting to me, and technological disasters in particular, is kind of twofold. One, I'm just generally interested in the intersection of human beings and technology, and the kind of foibles about people that those bring out. The one story I've written for the New Yorker was about the guys that clean the windows of high-rise buildings in Manhattan. And it was all about how, on one hand, you've got these guys who are still in the 21st century cleaning windows with sponges and buckets and dish detergent in buckets of hot water. But in order to get there, they have to have these incredibly complex computer-controlled rigs that carry them up and down the outside of these extraordinary buildings. So I'm interested in that kind of that aspect of the stories. But more broadly, the fact is that these events that bring out the best and the worst in people, disasters have a way of showing human beings are their most courageous and their worst, their most cowardly, their most cynical, and that's certainly true of both the Chernobyl disaster and the Challenger disaster. And moreover, because they're historical events, they took place at these inflection points in history. They're both kind of Cold War events, and I'm fascinated with that period in particular. So after I'd written the Chernobyl book, I was interested in sort of looking at the other side of the mirror, because they took place 3 months apart, these two events. And when I was publicizing the Chernobyl book, I would often be asked if I remembered where I was when I heard the news that the accident that happened, the Chernobyl accident. And I simply didn't. I mean, partly because I think that they tried to cover it up pretty effectively to begin with, but also just because growing up during the Cold War, you experienced such a sort of constant background undercurrent of nuclear terror that I think that one nuclear event or another didn't really make that much difference. But what I did remember, and I would always say is, but I do remember, the thing I remember very clearly where I was when I heard it was the Challenger disaster that happened almost exactly 3 months earlier. And I think that revealed to me and made clear to me in retrospect just exactly how much of a transformative event it was in the American and the global consciousness and the way that people thought about space flight and about high technology and about the promise of the future. And so it was the Challenger accident was a real turning point for people of our generation, I think, in a way that that no other event until 9/11 really was. And so there are all sorts of excellent reasons me being interested in writing about it.
I agree. What I'm also interested in is the fact that you picked Chernobyl as your first book, because I could imagine gathering information for Chernobyl would be very difficult. You're talking about another country. You're talking about another country where it's probably not that easy to just, again, walk in and start asking people about, what happened. So why pick Chernobyl? Why not pick an easier one? Like why not pick one where, it might be more documented in terms of what happened, but you almost started with a really hard one being Chernobyl. Like, I can just imagine trying to gather facts, talk to people, and put together the story would be incredibly difficult when it comes to what happened at Chernobyl.
Well, the truth is that, what interests me most in any of these stories and all of the reporting I've done as a magazine writer is, individual people's stories. And the reason that I first became interested in the Chernobyl story was actually was simply because I was looking for a magazine story to write, and I could see that there was an anniversary coming up.
Okay.
But the other thing was that I had very recently read, my then girlfriend, my now wife, had just given me a copy of Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, which is his book about the sinking of the Titanic. And it's an extraordinary book that's very short, it's concise, and it confines itself almost entirely just to the night of the sinking. It starts on the eve of the sinking and it's finished when, the last people go into the water. And it's an incredible book. And Lord worked on it for years and years, and he based it on two things. One was the testimony before the two inquiries that took place into the Titanic sinking in Britain and in America. And the other was that he hunted down 65 survivors of the sinking and interviewed them. And he got their stories. And that's the thing that makes the book so vivid and brings the events so alive to the reader. And so when I thought about writing about Chernobyl in the first place, and this was actually coming up to the 20th anniversary of the accident. So I was thinking about this back in 2005.
Wow.
But what I thought I wanted to do was I wanted to do that. I wanted to take Walter Lord's approach to the Chernobyl accident. And I just wanted to write about the events of that night as recalled by eyewitnesses. So when you say, well, why did you choose to write about this? It seemed, getting the documents and everything. I wasn't focused on that because initially I wasn't thinking about writing a book about it. I wanted to get eyewitness testimony. And at that point in time, back in 2005, the Chernobyl disaster seemed to be, something that was just this kind of minor historical blip. Because when it happened so close to the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was really kind of eclipsed in the public imagination by everything that happened afterwards. And so while it was a big deal at the time, by 2005, people didn't really think much about it. And that was especially true in, Russia and Ukraine, where, all of those subsequent events, if the collapse of the Soviet Union had eclipsed those events in the minds of people in the West, they certainly had in former Soviet countries. So when I first went out to Moscow and to Kiev to start interviewing people, a lot of people were only too happy to talk to me about it, because for some of them it was it was a heroic event in their life. For others, it was obviously deeply traumatic and terrible. But for both groups of people, it was something that was being forgotten. So the idea that somebody was going to come and start, talking to them about this in order to retell their stories, made them keen to talk to me in many cases. So on that initial approach, it was not really that difficult when I started doing it. And I interviewed for the magazine piece probably, 15 people. But you're right. After that, I wanted to write a book about it immediately, because as soon as I started talking to these people and hearing their testimony about what had happened and their experience, I found it so incredible that I just thought there's definitely a book in there. But nobody was interested. I couldn't get arrested with the idea of writing a book about it. And I kept trying for years. And it wasn't until after the Fukushima accident in 2011 that Chernobyl really was recast in a different light and seemed much more relevant. And after that, it became much easier. But there was this huge tranche of information, albeit in Russian and Ukrainian, that was available to use to report on, to tell the story in that kind of detail.
So you're now fluent in Russian, Adam?
I was only able to do that book because I had an enormous amount of help from fixers and translators in Russia and in Ukraine. And to this day, I think I can say yes, no, please, thank you. And I also know the Russian for atomic energy station. But apart from that, no.
So you finished the book on Chernobyl. How do you pick Challenger as the next one? Again, the one similarity is, like you're saying, is that they happened close together, but the similarities, and they're both disasters, but the similarities must stop pretty soon, right? Like they're very different events. They happen in two different countries. One of them happened on live television. Why the Challenger as the next book to write?
Oh, because for the reason that I mentioned before, which was that I was really struck when I was forced to start thinking about it, by the fact that it's one of those events that I recalled exactly where I was when it happened. And I became gradually aware of the fact that, despite my own natural solipsism, that, there's as you said before, there's a whole generation of people who've been born since it happened who really don't know very much about it at all, and don't neither realize how much of a turning point in history it was, and how there was a time before the Challenger accident and a time afterwards. But also that a lot of those people I felt who knew the story or thought they knew the story, knew it through one specific focus, which was through the story of Kristen McAuliffe, the teacher in space, because she was the focus of all of the publicity around the mission before the launch took place. And quite understandably, a lot of the focus afterwards, because she was the one member of the crew that so many people who were watching the launch identified with, because she was a civilian. And so I really, the more I dug into the story, the more I realized, how fascinating the stories of each member of the crew was. Every one of the 7 people on Challenger that day, had an amazing path and a life to the launch, towards the launch pad that day. But moreover, the one part of the story that had never really been told in a way that I thought it should have been was the story of the handful of rocket engineers who tried to stop the launch happening, in this incredibly dramatic meeting the night before takeoff. And so I thought that if I could knit together all of the lives of all of those, dozen people in the lead up to the launch, then you have a very powerful, not only a very powerful, human narrative, but also a sort of fascinating history book.
Oh, you get to that point in the book, you can't put it down. Like you have to know how it played out. The whole book builds up to that, to some degree, to that moment, and you know where this is going. And then when you get there, you can't put the book down. It is, you have to know how it played out that day. And again, I would highly encourage people to pick up the book and take a read of it, because it is that decision-making process. I bet you things like that play out every day today. Now again, the stakes are probably going to be a lot lower, but people make decisions that have risk attached to them, and that's ultimately what what a lot of that is. But what I'm going to do first, Adam, I think it would be fun let's go back to 1961, because the space race then was different than what it is today. And I'm just going to go back in time. On April 12th of 1961, the Russians were the first person to send a person into space. And then shortly thereafter, about a month later, JFK did a speech. John F. Kennedy, the then president of the United States. It is a famous speech. I'm going to play a very small excerpt. Now, Adam, I was originally going to try and read this, and I realized if I try and read this, I'm going to butcher this whole thing, because John F. Kennedy was one of the great speakers of, the last 100 years. And this is just one speech that he did. I cannot, with a good, good heart here, try and read this. It's unfair to the people who are listening. So copyright be damned, I'm playing this, Adam. If this is the end of the podcast after this, then it's worth it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a short excerpt from JFK's speech. And then I'm going to ask Adam a couple of questions. So let's just see if I can get the tech working properly here.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Okay, so if we look at that speech, there's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight, because what President Kennedy is saying is, in 1961, he's saying, we are going to beat the Russians to the moon. We are going to send somebody to the moon by the end of that decade. And I got to say too, greatest quotes in history. We do things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Man, if you want words to live by, I don't know if NASA has those words hanging in the rafters of their building, but that is a great quote. One of many of JFK's great quotes. But in any event, I listened to that speech, Adam. I hear a couple of things from JFK. Number one, the dangers of space travel. Number two, the pressure that the U.S. government is putting on the engineers. And number three, the high-profile nature of the space program at the time. And I think, although the Challenger disaster happened several years, let's call it 25 years after that speech, roughly, a lot of those elements, I believe, were still there. So I just wanted to get your perspective. Danger of space travel, pressure from the U.S. government, high-profile nature of the program. What do you think? Do you think there's a link between that JFK speech and how things played out over time? What are your thoughts? Do you see it the same way, or do you see it differently?
I mean, I do see it differently, because although all those elements were clearly there, I think that they had taken on an extremely different valence by the time the space shuttle program began, and certainly by the time of the Challenger accident. One thing is that, the speech you we just listened to, makes it clear that this is a patriotic enterprise, which is also at the heart of a Cold War contest between the United States and the USSR. And that just wasn't true of the space shuttle, because although they were working on building their own version of the space shuttle that looked almost identical to the space shuttle, this was not really a contest in the same way, because there was no goal. There was no shared goal that they were attempting to beat one another to. The object of the moon had been placed firmly in the past. The other is that because of that, both because of that lack of goal, because of that lack of competition, although the space shuttle was used very ably by President Reagan as a symbol of a resurgent America, because the first launch took place, very early in his first term, and he managed to recast the space shuttle program and NASA's exploits as being part of what he termed the high frontier, and therefore, presented it in the context of Americans' traditional, pushing forward of boundaries in the American West. It suited him down to the ground. So it had a patriotic element in that way, but because it was not in direct competition with the Russians, and there was not this convenient goal in mind, it meant that the amount of public support for the program and congressional interest in funding it was a lot less. And at the same time, the issue of how hazardous space flight really was, which had been at the forefront of the program in the early 1960s, because it was manifestly dangerous. And people were on the edge of their seats every time they saw footage of one of these astronauts going up the gantry to a single man climbing into a one-man capsule to launch into space. Part of the point of the space shuttle program and the way that it was presented to the public was that it was going to make space shuttle a matter of routine, space travel a matter of routine, and that the space shuttle would fly into space with the ease and regularity of a passenger jet airliner. Now, that was a misleading impression. Space flight during the space shuttle program was every bit as hazardous as it was in the 1960s. And the engineers and the astronauts who worked at NASA at the time during the shuttle program, clearly understood that. But, NASA sort of ambiently allowed the public to begin to believe otherwise. And part of the way that they did that was by, encouraging people to believe that the shirt sleeve environment in which the astronauts flew into space aboard the shuttle, they wore these blue flight suits. They didn't wear the pressure suits that everybody's familiar with from the Apollo program, with the bubble helmets and everything. That made it an environment that would be welcoming and convenient for ordinary civilians like Christa McAuliffe to fly into space. And so they forged this idea of the spaceflight participant program, in which first a teacher, but then, with growing frequency, different kinds of other civilians, reporters, artists, photographers, would be permitted to fly into space aboard the shuttle. And this all, contributed towards an impression that the public had that this was just, a routine operation. It wasn't any different from climbing on a jumbo jet. And that meant that when the accident took place, people were absolutely stunned in a way that, in retrospect, is difficult to imagine. Not only because they'd come to think of NASA as an almost infallible organization, but also because they'd been sold on this idea that it was like an airline into space.
So, and because you start your book with another disaster where there was a fire on the launch pad, and there was there was lives lost. What do you think it was that what trick do you think they played then? How did the public forget kind of those, the famous movie, Apollo 13, right? We all, waiting for that, that capsule to emerge. The world was watching. What do you think changed with the space shuttle? I love the analogy that you just made, is that, and I think it puts it in perspective for people, is that they wanted to make this as simple as going to an airport and hopping on a jumbo jet. and flying from Toronto to Vancouver or from New York to LA. Like, it was like that. Do you think you're taking risk when you're doing that? No, you think you're going to survive, and and that is how the kind of shuttle was portrayed. But do you think that they just people just forgot about what happened in the 60s to some of those astronauts?
Absolutely. I think that by 1986, the first accident you're talking about, the Apollo 1 fire, in which 3 astronauts were killed on the pad at Cape Canaveral, that really had receded into history. And that's partly because that had just been, that took place in 1967. But then when Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon in 1969, the enormous success and astonishing achievement of that, that obviously overshadowed everything that went before. And, and that's one of the reasons why, The Right Stuff was such a phenomenon when Tom Wolfe published that book in the 1970s, was because people had forgotten. But, it's chiefly about the Mercury astronauts, the Mercury 7, who flew in the early 60s. And people had kind of forgotten about those guys because of the Apollo program. It's like, man walks on moon, that's going to really crowd out a lot of other activity in the space program. But the interesting thing about Apollo 13, people had not forgotten about that. But NASA, which, if nothing else, was extraordinary about public relations and about image building, and still is in a way, had managed to recast that, not as a disaster, but as a successful failure. So it's, we think about it now. We don't think about really the fact that they made so many mistakes that they almost stranded 3 astronauts 250,000 miles out in deep space to die of suffocation. But their amazing ingenuity and resourcefulness and the heroism of the astronauts and people on the ground, managed to pull back from the brink of disaster these 3 men in what seemed like an engineering miracle. And it was. But that's how it's remembered. It's remembered as an absolute triumph, not as a series of unbelievable calamities.
Agreed. I totally agree with you. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. What were some of the risks of the space shuttle? We talk about, again, we want to perceive this as, no different than flying from New York to LA. But that's not the situation. Maybe just talk a little bit about, some of the risks. I find it fascinating that, again, once those boosters are turned on, they can't be turned off. There's no way to get out. Maybe just talk a little bit about some of the risks of the space shuttle that were there, and that people just, again, it is what it is. They just chose to accept those risks.
Well, I mean, this is the other major difference I didn't mention between, NASA and the space program back in 1961 when Kennedy made that speech, and what it was in the 1980s, which was that, when he made that announcement that they were going to commit to sending men to the moon and returning them safely to Earth by the end of the 1960s, that opened a spigot of financing that was just almost limitless. They had all of the money they needed to achieve that target, and especially so after Kennedy was assassinated. And it was a very difficult economic time. This is the 1960s are a time of economic boom in the United States. And by the turn of the decade, when they started seriously considering the options of the space shuttle, all of that had changed. The war in Vietnam, the cost of the Great Society program that Johnson had instigated, economic disaster around the world, ravaging inflation. It meant that when NASA officials brought their initial budget expectations to the White House to ask for the money to build the space shuttle, there was no money available for it. So I think that they asked for, I'm trying to remember the figures, they asked for something like $14 billion to build the space shuttle.
In the 1970s or the 80s. So you put that in inflation, I don't even know what the number is, but it is a heck of a lot bigger than the number you just said.
It was a lot of money. They asked for 14, they said, we can just about do this for $14 billion. And the budget office came back and they said, well, you can have 5.5. But NASA, because they felt at that point that, the future of manned spaceflight in the United States, and possibly the future of the agency itself, was reliant on bringing this thing to fruition, they said, sure, we'll do the best we can. So from the outset, they were attempting to achieve the almost impossible in a field of engineering that was already filled with unbelievable challenges. But it meant that they made some very dangerous compromises right at the very beginning. And the first and one of the most important ones was that they abandoned the idea of having a means of escape for the astronauts in the first 2 minutes of flight on ascent to orbit. And that is something that had been present in every manned spacecraft that NASA had flown up to that point. They always had a rocket-powered escape system in all of the spacecraft they'd flown before. And for the first time with the Space Shuttle, they said, we're not going to do that. We're just going to make it, it's going to be like flying an airliner. And you don't have a rocket-powered escape system on an airliner. You don't need one. It's so safe. You don't have that. So they got rid of that. And then they decided that because another part, a unique aspect of the shuttle was that it was to be reusable. They would have these reusable rocket boosters that would strap onto the sides of the fuel tank on which the shuttle orbiter, the part that looked like an aircraft, sat. And in their initial designs, those rockets were to be liquid fuel powered. They would have rocket engines very similar to the ones that had powered the rockets that took people to the moon. And those were extremely controllable. They could be turned on and off. If there was a fault in flight, they could shut them down and then maybe restart them once they'd found out what the fault was. But those would have been not only very expensive, but also not very easy to reuse once they'd been parachuted into the ocean in salt water. So NASA decided to look instead to solid rocket boosters, which were much more like, in principle, much more like giant fireworks, in the sense that you light the fuse and the fuel begins burning, and then they can't be shut down, they can't be throttled back. They're just going to keep burning until all the fuel is consumed, and then they'll stop burning. But in the time that they're burning, you can't stop them or control them in any way. So the combination of the lack of escape in the first 2 minutes and the fact that these things, the solid rockets, are going to burn uncontrollably for 2 minutes, made the space shuttle from the outset an extremely risky endeavor.
And when you read Adam's book, you're going to learn more than you ever thought possible about rocket boosters. And
I like to think, Scott, that it's just enough so you understand what's going on. Too much.
The reality is the way you articulate it in the book is easy for a layperson to understand. You do not need to be a rocket engineer.
That's what I want to hear.
With mission accomplished. So so maybe just talk a little bit, because there's two pieces of this I want you to touch on, which again make this simple. Number one, that the boosters were assembled in pieces. What were the risks associated with the boosters being assembled in pieces, and why did they have to do that? Because again, that's a very simple thing for someone like me, an accountant, to understand, is that you're when I was reading your book, I was thinking about Lego. Maybe that's not the perfect, analogy, but that's how I was kind of thinking about it, is that these are these Lego pieces that are being put together. But maybe just talk about that decision first in terms of assembling the rocket booster in pieces, as opposed to as one, complete unit.
Right. So the first point to make about this is that although I've just described them as being in principle similar to giant fireworks, that's to do with the propellant and the nature of the flight. In other ways, they're as unlike giant fireworks as you can imagine, because each of these things was 150 feet high and 12 feet across. So they were absolutely massive. And it was technologically feasible to build such a rocket as a monolithic structure in a single piece. But there are all sorts of drawbacks to doing that, not least of which was that if you were trying to transport it across the country from the plant, which ended up being in northern Utah, where they were manufactured, to the launch pads in Cape Canaveral, then if you have an accident with a monolithic rocket that's 150 feet high and packed with solid fuel propellant, the consequences would be unimaginably catastrophic. So there are lots of good reasons why you wouldn't want to build one in a single piece. And what they chose to do instead was to build them in four main sections, which could be transported, each one of which could be transported much more easily and safely by rail all the way across the country from the molten thiokol plant in Utah to Florida. But that meant that what would happen is that they would be laid on their sides, these segments, and put on specially built rail cars, and then delivered ultimately to the vehicle assembly building in Florida, where they would then be stacked one on top of the other and sealed together. And it was imperative that the seals between those joints be absolutely gas tight, because if they weren't, when the rockets lit and some superheated gas from inside the propellant chamber, which was hollowed out of the solid core of the rocket, began leaking through any place in one of those joints, it wouldn't just be a sort of little leak that would carry on for the 2 minutes of flight and nobody would pay much attention to it, because the gas would be burning at somewhere approaching 6,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So even a jet of gas the width of a pencil would cut through the steel casing of the rocket, which was 1/2 inch thick, just like a hot knife through butter. And as soon as that happened, really, you'd have a catastrophe on your hands. Either the rocket itself would just disintegrate, or the jet of gas could cut into the fuel tank beside which it sat in what they call the stack of the space shuttle, and that could cause disintegration of the entire stack and the shuttle itself. So they needed to make sure that those seals were as tight as possible.
And that is going to then lead us to our discussion on the O-ring. The other piece to the puzzle here. Now you might think, well, what's an O-ring? Is it some massively complicated piece of engineering? And I would say, now I'm going to oversimplify this, Adam. You can buy them for $5 at Home Depot. I looked it up online. These are, it's a piece of rubber. And again, I just make it as a point. Now I know I can imagine it's a big piece of rubber, but maybe just talk a little bit about the importance of the O-ring in all of this and how that relates to the assembly of and what you're talking about, the leakage of anything that may get out, and how that would be how the O-rings kind of played a role in all of that.
Right. So the joints in the rockets were held together using a series of different methods. So first of all, they were stacked one on top of the other, and the joint was connected using what they called a tang and a clevis joint, which was very similar to the tongue and groove joint between two floorboards, for example. So you have a sort of tongue that fits into a slot. And then that joint was secured with 177 steel alloy pins, which were driven through the joint all the way through. And then within the joint, because that still wasn't quite tight enough, even though the tolerances were extremely fine, then it would be sealed with a thick layer of fireproof asbestos-containing putty, and then a pair of rubber O-rings, which, as you say, in principle, it's the same as what you'd find in a tap or a faucet in a bathroom. It's a rubber ring that goes around the joint that seals two surfaces together. But again, as with the rocket itself, in principle, yes, it's just like the washer in a faucet. But in execution, this thing is 37 feet long and only 1/4 inch thick. And this meant that, given the tolerances between the metal surfaces of the joint are so fine, it meant that this could not be damaged or contaminated in any way, because if it was, that could potentially cause a leak. And when I say contaminated, it meant that the technicians who put together the joints of the rocket had to, be dressed in white caps and white coats and handle everything with extraordinary care, because if a piece of contamination the size of either a human hair or a piece of lint got between the edge of the rubber seal and the metal housing of the rocket, that was enough in itself to cause a leak. And what they discovered as the space shuttle's first missions began to take place, and they began to recover the burned out rockets from the ocean, they began to find that there was actually damage to these rockets that was caused by escaping gas, burning and what they called eroding them in flight. And so this was a phenomenon that started appearing on the second space shuttle flight in 1981, and then continued intermittently for years. But fatally, what happened is that, although initially concerned, and then frequently thereafter concerned about developments and changes in this damage that they saw evolving over the years the space shuttle kept flying, the engineers at NASA and at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that was building the rockets, gradually convinced themselves that they understood what the cause of this sort of damage was, and that it didn't pose a threat to flight safety. And the truth was, we know in retrospect, that they didn't really understand what was happening. They didn't really understand the causes of it, and their supposed fixes were not fixing the problem. And that is ultimately what led towards the accident.
So we fast forward to the morning of the accident. The temperatures are one of the coldest days in Florida history. It's already been delayed a couple of times in terms of the in terms of the launch. What were the risks of launching in the cold weather? How did the O-ring? What was the belief on the O-ring, and what would happen to that O-ring if they were to launch in the cold weather on that on that fateful morning on January 28th?
Well, what some engineers established as the shuttle launches went on in the years leading up to the accident was that joint between the segments of the solid rocket boosters had been badly designed from the outset, and should probably have been redesigned before the first shuttle flew. And there were all sorts of problems as a result of that bad design. But almost exactly a year before the Challenger launch took place, they had a launch that took place in what was then, in January 1985, the coldest weather in Florida history. And although the engineers at Morton Thiokol who did this disassembly and examination of the rockets after they'd been recovered from the ocean and seen all sorts of damage in the rocket joints before and to the O-rings before this flight, when one engineer in particular, Roger Beaujolais, who worked at Thiokol, examined the joints after that January 1985 flight, he saw worse damage and kinds of damage that he'd never seen before in the rocket boosters. And it absolutely terrified him. And initially he couldn't work out what could possibly have caused it. But he began to develop a theory that what had happened was that in the extreme cold, this artificial rubber that the O-ring was made from had become stiff and inflexible. And instead of expanding and extruding into the joint as the joint opened up with the forces and pressures of ignition on the launch pad, as they had come to expect it to do, it hadn't managed to flex as much as it needed to. It was brittle, and as a result had allowed hot gas from inside the rocket to leak past it. And so he became extremely concerned about the prospect of further launches in cold weather. And he took this to his bosses, but they gradually convinced him that what had happened in January 1985 was a once in a century cold weather event. It was a meteorological freak. And so as they began to think more seriously about redesigning these joints and fixing all of the different problems that they'd found with them, Beaujolais himself was happy to keep flying the shuttle because he thought, well, that was January in Florida, and now we're into March, now we're into April. Weather's warming up. We're already working on the fix for the joint. And that was a 100-year weather event. So by the time there's another day that's the coldest day in Florida history, with this, we're going to be our fix is going to be long in the past. The rocket joint will be absolutely fine by the time that happens. So we'll be fine. So imagine Beaujolais' horror and terror when he discovered just over a year later that the weather forecast predicted the coldest day in Florida history all over again, just over a year after the last one. And at that point, he and the other engineers at Morton Thiokol pressed forward with insisting that the launch be stopped and that Challenger should not attempt to leave the launch pad until the weather had warmed up sufficiently to bring it back within their expectations for temperatures at which the O-rings might function as they should do.
And look, the entire book is fantastic, but like we talked about earlier, that whole day, that whole process, which involved sign-offs and phone calls. And again, you got to remember, this is the mid-'80s. this isn't cell phones. This is fax machines and landlines and, and communicate. It is a fascinating sequence of events in terms of how that day unfolded. But at the end of the day, Adam, when he put up his hand and said, hey, I don't think we should launch, why didn't anyone listen to him? Because you had NASA, you had the manufacturer, were kind of the two main, let's call it decision makers in all of this. Puts up his hand and says, look, it's too cold. Is it just, is hindsight 2020? Where we look back and say, we should have listened to him? Or was it, what, there was legit concerns they never should have launched that shuttle?
Oh, I think it's definitely the second one. I mean, there is definitely an argument to be made that, it's the events are not necessarily as clear cut as, some people would like to represent them as in the way the story has been told in the past. And I wanted to make sure that I showed that and demonstrate that in the book, that it's not a kind of black and white issue in which you've got on one hand, the white-hatted, good-hearted engineers at Morton Thiokol, and on the other hand, the stovepipe-hatted, moustache-twirling villains of NASA. It didn't play out as cleanly as that. But the concerns that Beaujolais and his colleagues brought forward should definitely have been taken much more seriously. And it bewildered me as much as I think it would bewilder the reader, to discover that they went ahead anyway. When you learn exactly how they presented the information and their arguments. But the truth is that there were a lot of commercial concerns that, overrode safety concerns, because, the manufacturer of the solid rockets, Morton Thiokol, who had the contract to build the solid rockets for the Space Shuttle years into the future, had become concerned in the months leading up to the Challenger launch that NASA was going to put the contract for building these rockets out to tender to a competitor. And that contract was worth $1 billion to Morton Thiokol. And it was the contract that kept not only the plant in Utah humming all the time, but effectively that plant supported all of the local community and had done for years. So the prospect of doing anything that might upset their most important customer and to go against something that their most important customer clearly wanted to do, was not insignificant in the decision-making process. To the extent that what happened is that not just Roger Beaujolais, who was a mid-level engineer at the company, but all of the senior managers had, in the run-up to this teleconference taking place the night before the accident, had sent a written document to NASA saying, we cannot recommend a launch. So that was a no-go recommendation. And over the course of that night, hours before the launch actually took place, they flip-flopped and turned against the recommendations of their own engineers and officially sent a recommendation that went from no-go to go in the space of a few hours. And after that point, it was extremely difficult to stop the launch going ahead.
So the launch goes, the worst thing possibly happens, obviously, that Challenger explodes 90 seconds after takeoff. You have all these, kids watching this on, in their classrooms with the, the TV in those days being, wheeled into the classroom, and, all of these classic scenes. People are obviously the reaction in the United States and globally, is people are horrified. And maybe just talk a little bit about then the Rogers Commission and what was the task of the Rogers Commission to, what was their goal, and how was it kind of, how was that put together in terms of taking a look and seeing, okay, what actually happened on this launch day? How could this possibly have happened?
Well, the story of the Rogers Commission and how they conducted that inquiry was one of the most fascinating parts of the research for me, because I approached it thinking that, well, the president has just, it's a massive catastrophe. President Reagan naturally appoints an external body to examine what's happened and make sure it never happens again. They go ahead, they draw their conclusions, and, NASA reacts in accordance with their findings. But that isn't what happened at all. And this is another very big difference between what you were talking about with Kennedy and the space program in the 60s and what happened in the 80s, is that in the wake of the Apollo 1 fire, NASA was allowed to investigate itself. And to this day, it seems highly likely that formed a kind of whitewash, and that, appropriate scapegoats were found. Now, that took place in a media environment where the media, the public, Congress was all broadly supportive of the space program and was invested in the race to the moon. By the 1980s, in the wake of Vietnam, of Watergate, of the resignation of President Nixon, the media and Congress were certainly not on the side of government institutions, and were only too happy, or only too prepared, I should say, to believe in, malfeasance at the highest levels being something that was not only possible, but quite likely. And so after the initial few days in which NASA did begin investigation into itself, then responsibility for that was taken out of their hands and given to William Rogers and his commission, because President Reagan's chief of staff determined that they could not afford to have even the appearance of any kind of cover-up or lack of transparency. And yet when Rogers announced to the press, what his intentions were, he initially made clear that he had no intention of going after and destroying the agency. He went on the record and said, "I think that the agency has been doing an extremely good job, and I think that the American people think that too. And so we will proceed accordingly." But then in the first week, the first 10 days of this inquiry taking place, he began to realize that the senior NASA officials that he was talking to on the stand in this inquiry, in public inquisition, were really not being completely honest with him, and actually were kind of dissembling about what they knew about the lead up to the accident. And at that point, the inquiry became quite prosecutorial, and Rogers really began going after those NASA officials. And the drama that ensued is just absolutely fascinating.
So here's a story for you, is that I had mentioned to one of our leaders around here, I said, I've got Adam Higginbotham to come on and talk about his book on the Challenger. I said, do you remember the Challenger, blah, blah, blah. And we were talking about it. And then he said, he gives me one name. He goes, Scott, the person I really admire was Richard Feynman. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's, of all the things about Challenger, so that's an interesting thing. So then I do a little bit of research on Richard Feynman, and, find out he's a bit of a cowboy. I think someone had described him for an absolute distaste for authority, I think were certain words I had read. I'd read something else, again, I'm not sure if it's true or not, that when all of his colleagues on the commission were taking private limousine to the commission, to the hearings every day, him and one of the other guys were taking the subway every day. And then it finally understood why people around here where I work have a lot of admiration for Richard Feynman. Maybe, and I've heard you talk about Richard Feynman before, and you've made a point that, again, he was at a very difficult point in his life when he chose to actually go on the committee. But maybe just talk a little bit about Richard's role, because he was brilliant, like, again, a very smart person, but had the ability to kind of explain things in a simple way, let's call it, to people like me or the American public who were trying to get their head wrapped around this very complex engineering. Give us some perspective on Richard.
So Feynman was an absolute genius, obviously, and a fascinating character, but nothing if not an expert curator of his own myth. And it's clear from there's an amazing biography of Feynman by James Glick called Genius, in which Glick makes clear that the only reason that Feynman served on the commission in the first place is because his wife convinced him to. Because, as you say, he knew that he was dying of cancer at the time that he was called by the acting administrator of NASA and asked if he would serve on the commission. And as a result, he knew that it was probably the last thing he'd ever do with his life, and was reluctant to commit that time to the inquiry. But according to Glick, his wife convinced him that, there was every chance that this commission that was packed with, aerospace officials, former astronauts, current astronauts, people from the Pentagon, could turn out to be just a whitewash. But what it really needed was a maverick investigator who would follow his nose and the facts. And this naturally appealed to a man like the bongo playing, marijuana smoking Richard Feynman.
That also came up in the discussion. He certainly was an interesting character, yes, with a colorful background,
right.
yes.
And he's if you've seen Oppenheimer, there's a hilarious cameo where in one shot, just in the background, there's a young man playing the bongos.
I'll have to go back and watch that. Yeah.
Which I'm pretty sure is supposed to be Feynman. But anyway, but the truth is that other members of the commission absolutely hated Feynman because they thought that he was a kind of showboating loose cannon. That's a terrible mixed metaphor, but you get the idea that he was interested in public attention as much as he was in finding out the truth. And there also some of the people on the commission that I spoke to were also remained, even almost 40 years later, kind of furious that Feynman is credited with the discovery of the cause of the accident. And the reason for that is because, as you say, part of his genius was in his ability to be able to translate complex scientific concepts into simple language that people could understand. And he did that with the problem of the O-rings and the coal. And he did that by this famous, I think even he put the word experiment into inverted commas because he knew it wasn't really an experiment, but this famous public demonstration where on camera during the committee hearings, he took a glass of ice water and a small sample of the O-ring material and placed it in a G-clamp into the ice water, and then on camera removed it from the ice water and then undid the clamp. And you could see that after it had been made cold, it became so inflexible that he'd used the clamp to fold it into a U shape, and it didn't spring back when he undid the clamp. It kind of remained in the U shape. And this, was not, he neither discovered nor had investigated up to that point the problem of the O-rings and the coal. But what this was a perfect crystallization of what the cause of the accident could. And because that was shown on the national news, because he used this demonstration to make the journalists in the audience suddenly understand and cut through all of the sort of double talk and technical language that the NASA engineers had been using on the stand to really, in some cases, try and obfuscate the truth. It was shown on the news, and people remember that. And in subsequent tellings, in the 40 years since, this has become Richard Feynman being the person who solved the mystery of the Challenger disaster. That is not what happened, which is not to take away from Feynman's extremely important role at the commission and his role in allowing people to understand what happened.
And if you put that aside, put the experiment aside, do you think that the committee reaches the same conclusion with Feynman on it versus without it? Because I always got the impression as well that Feynman was going to go hard on NASA, no matter what, especially when he started hearing inconsistencies and people trying to walk around words and things like that, that he was going to go hard on them, where maybe other members of the commission were not going to go as hard on NASA. And I'm just wondering, from everything you did, Adam, do you think the committee reaches a different, do you think there's a different set of recommendations that come out if Feynman isn't on the committee versus what came out with him on the committee?
Definitely, because when they were working on producing the report, which was published in June of 1986, and their recommendations, Feynman used to place his signature because it contained statements that William Rogers wrote that were essentially a continuation of the way in which he'd announced his intentions at the beginning of the inquiry, that he didn't want to destroy NASA as an agency. He believed that NASA had done a good job and it would do a good job into the future. And Feynman was disagreed extremely strongly with this, because as a scientist, as an engineer, he was appalled by the way in which the engineers and senior managers at NASA had effectively misled the public about the hazards of spaceflight aboard the shuttle and the way that they had, gambled with safety over the course of the program, to the point where he gave, after the report was eventually published with his name on it, he told reporters that he felt that NASA engineers had exaggerated the reliability of the shuttle system to the point of fantasy. And he was permitted to have his own opinion published in the report, which was known as Appendix F, which was extremely damning of the engineering in that.
Interesting. Now, what I want to do is circle back to what we talked about at the beginning, is the comparisons, because I'm fascinated to get your view, Adam, on the comparisons between how the investigations happened between Chernobyl and the investigations between the Challenger. I think, we might think in North America, oh, hey, something like this happens, we're going to be very transparent. And the one thing that comes across in your Chernobyl book is everything was very secretive. There was, intent to obviously limit information and about various items. And I guess my first question to you on this point would be, had the Challenger events not played out on live TV, they couldn't hide what happened. The world saw what happened. We didn't see what happened at Chernobyl. Chernobyl didn't play out on live television, and therefore the Russians could, more easy managed the information flow. You couldn't really do that on Challenger. We all saw what happened. And I'm just wondering, if it doesn't play out on live TV, if Challenger doesn't play on live TV, how do you think it plays out? Like, do you think that it would have been played out closer to Chernobyl, where, there was an intent to kind of cover up what happened, and obviously they're going to try and learn and make sure it doesn't happen again. But do you think it would have played out differently if this didn't happen on live television?
I mean, that's an interesting question, but it seems to me to kind of start from a false premise, which is that if NASA was not the traditionally extremely transparent organization that it always had been, would things have turned out different? Probably, but that was one of the founding principles of the agency, and one of the reasons for that was that the agency relied on publicity for its continued engagement with the public and for its future and its future funding, and so they were constantly, it was part of the DNA of NASA that they would show these things on live television because they wanted people to be excited about the space program. It's not like the Soviet nuclear program, where they, for obvious reasons, didn't want anybody to know anything about what was going on. The public engagement with transparency of NASA was central to its mission. Now, having said that, Apollo 1 did not play out live as a test, was never intended to leave the launch pad. And that has since, by the suspicion of cover-up and whitewash. But nothing on the scale of what happened in Chernobyl. And, they tried to cover up the fact that the accident had happened at all. And, if the wind had been blowing in the right direction, they might have succeeded in it. So in that sense, there's really no comparison.
Another difference between the two as well is that the engineers who were at fault at Chernobyl went to prison, where I don't believe anybody associated with Challenger ever went to prison. Now, the nature of these disasters are completely different. The amount of people that were affected as a result of Chernobyl, obviously quite different than the number of people who were affected for Challenger. So again, there's differences. Did that ever come up in your discussions? Do you think maybe the folks at Chernobyl, the Russians were too harsh on the engineers at Chernobyl to actually sentence some of these folks to prison? Or on the flip side, do you think they went off too easy on some of the folks who made the decisions in Challenger? Any points on those two comparisons, Adam, between the two?
Well, people should have gone to prison over what happened in Chernobyl, but none of the right people were sent to prison. The engineers who were sent to prison over Chernobyl should never have been in prison. That was a part of the cover-up. was that the people who were actually responsible for the accident could not possibly be held in the view of the Soviet government, because that would have struck at the heart of the state. Now, in the case of Challenger, there are certainly many people, including people who worked at NASA, who believed that those responsible for the launch decision should have been held criminally liable for what happened. But William Rogers, both a former Secretary of State for the United States and a former prosecutor, held that would not happen because they could not prove a case of criminal negligence about anyone involved. That they did not. Subsequent legal action was by members of the crew's families, but most of those were thrown out.
This recently about the formation of the Rogers Commission. One of the reasons why the Rogers Commission was put together was because you had a press that were kind of, at odds with Congress. And I'd love to just get your perspective on the role of investigative journalists in both of those, because when you read the Chernobyl book, you certainly don't, there were, at least I didn't see any investigative journalists that were based in Russia who were out, putting on the front page of the newspaper what had happened. Whereas again, in North America, it's a different type of environment. How do you think the role of investigative journalists played out in Russia versus, do you think that's a difference between the two? And do you see that as a good thing within North America, that again, the role of an investigative journalist can actually move the needle to some degree, and that can actually enact information coming to light, whereas in Russia, at least at the time, given the nature of the events, it maybe wasn't as effective. And again, there's probably lots of reasons for that. But just your 2 cents on the role of investigative journalists in both of those events.
Well, actually, one of the reasons that Chernobyl was remarkable was that journalists did actually visit the site and did begin to report on the causes of the accident. And obviously, they did so in a way that was very different from the way they would be permitted to do so in the United States or any Western country. But because of glasnost, of open government, that Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, had used as slogans in the months before the Chernobyl accident, but not actually done anything to effect in practical terms. After the accident, he began allowing more openness in the press, and reporters did go to the site, and this began a gradual unraveling of Soviet secrecy that allowed people to print the truth about what had happened, and that is ultimately why the truth did eventually emerge. In the case of Challenger, investigative journalists were absolutely central to the way in which the Rogers Commission's investigation played out. And I interviewed a number of those journalists who were working for the New York Times at the time, who were assigned to the story. And they explained to me that what happened is, in the initial phase of the investigation, it was information that they were passing to members of the commission and publishing in the paper that allowed the investigation to proceed and discover the truth as they did. And then as the investigation proceeded, the flow of information began to go in the opposite direction, and members of the commission then were passing information from their own investigations back. And part of the reason that the story of the Rogers Commission is so fascinating is because of that, the progress of that relationship and the way in which information was released in the media and undermined the narratives that for various reasons.
That's interesting. So 2 last questions for you, Adam, as we wrap up here. They did a multi-part series on HBO about Chernobyl, which was fascinating. It was, can we expect to see this something similar for Challenger? Because I think it would certainly be very interesting if someone were to take your book and create something similar to what they did with Chernobyl for HBO, to do something similar for Challenger. Has there been any interest? Because I think that would be a terrific, multi on the sequence of events for Challenger.
Yeah, it would be. But I that's all they're doing, that kind of thing. But that, my I always take a very wait and see approach to that kind of.
I see. And what's the next project? I can imagine, the book, the research just bleeds out of the book. I can just imagine the time and effort that you spent putting together the book. What is the next one going to be a disaster, or are we gonna change up? Can you give us any little hints on what the next project is coming from Adam down the road?
Scott, I'll tell you what's in my future, which is that today is Tuesday, and on Friday I'm going on vacation.
Well, that's a good focus. That is. Well, we will certainly be interested in your next book. But until then, again, I would encourage everybody, if you think you know what happened on Challenger, you don't. So take a read of Adam's book. And if you're too young to remember what happened on Challenger, pick up his book, because again, you're going to learn a lot about how that played out. And again, a lot of lessons can be applied can be applied today. So Adam, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. And when your next book comes out, we would love to circle up again and have another chat. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.